Hello, my name is Paul Rosenblum. Today I'm representing a research team from multiple disciplines and multiple organizations and presenting a proposal for extending the common model of cognition to emotion. I'll start by briefly reviewing the common model before digging into the new proposal. The common model is a developing consensus about what is required in a cognitive architecture. In particular, it concerns what can be called human-like minds. That includes not only human minds, but other natural and artificial minds that can be modeled in a similar manner at a suitable level of abstraction. This need not include all AI or AGI minds, or even all natural minds, such as animal minds. This consensus developed from analyzing existing cognitive architectures, from consulting with researchers who study and develop cognitive architectures, and from research results relevant to cognitive architectures. The common model is abstract, radically incomplete, and not directly executable. As such, it isn't a cognitive architecture in a traditional sense. Instead, it's an on-paper design that is intended to capture this consensus. It includes what the community can reach a consensus on concerning necessity, based essentially on polling of the community. Sufficiency here is only relevant to what topics are considered for consensus building. Structurally, the common model consists of procedural and declarative long-term memories, plus perception and motor modules that interact with an external environment. There is also a working memory module through which all of these other modules can interact. Although except for the procedural long-term memory, they can only interact with dedicated buffers within the working memory. In addition to this structure, the initial model also includes 16 assumptions about how this all worked, divided up according to whether they concern structure and processing, memory and content, learning, or perception and motor control. So, for example, it's assumed that significant parallelism exists both within and across modules and content. Yet there is sequential behavior that arises from a cognitive cycle that runs at approximately 50 milliseconds in humans. Another example is that long-term memories contain symbolic data with associated quantitative metadata. I tend to think of this as involving data metadata dyads. In essence, this makes it a deeply hybrid model. Also, learning is assumed to be incremental as a side effect of performance rather than as a deliberate act of the cognitive system. The work covered here is intended to deal with just a part of the radical incompleteness of the common model by focusing on emotion. The assumption here is that emotion isn't simply a quirk of human nature, but is essential to surviving and thriving in challenging physical and social domains. You can think of it essentially as part of the wisdom of evolution. It may be coarse in its application, but it makes it difficult to behave in other ways without significant effort. The proposal here, though, is far from a full model of emotion. It focuses only on particular architectural aspects of how emotional states arise and affect cognition. It abstracts over details of the various appraisal and dimensional models, and it avoids such topics as how emotional states are reflected in external expressions. It also doesn't include deliberate reasoning about emotion, although it leaves room for it in the cognitive system. The proposal grew out of an earlier analysis of emotion and the common model, and also out of a virtual workshop on the topic held back in June of 2022. An initial synthesis came out of the latter part of that workshop that included adding an affect module to the common model. This new module receives input from physiology to react to bodily state, from perception for immediate reactions to the state of the world, from a dedicated working memory buffer for reactions to the state of the cognitive system, and from working memory more broadly to set the context for affective processing. In turn, this module affects the remainder of the common model. It provides input back to the working memory buffer to support cognitive reasoning. It filters communications between other modules and working memory. You can see that diagrammatically here by the dot-dash arrows coming from the affect module, going back to the circles in the middle of the traditional arrows from the common model. Effectively, what this causes is, or enables, is for the affect module to influence what shows up in working memory and in what form, and what is learned and in what form. The affect module also directly affects perception in influencing what the cognitive system perceives from the external environment. Coming out of the workshop, there was a sense of consensus with respect to something like the synthesis, but it reflected only a few days' work by a subset of the community, and it only came together at the final session. So it didn't seem right to consider it as an official consensus at that point. It was furthermore still quite minimal in coverage. So a subgroup decided to push the model further before going back to the community to see if a more thorough consensus was reachable. This proposal is the product of these deliberations. Here's the refined synthesis that came out of these deliberations. One of the first things we did was to relabel the affect module as emotion, when it became clear that the role of this module was to generate emotional vectors, but with no commitment to size or contents. So, for example, it could be a two-place vector consisting of valence and arousal, where these are generated by some kind of aggregations over appraisals. Or it could be an extended dimensional model, where in fact each place is an appraisal of some sort. As just implied, appraisals act as inputs to the creation of these vectors, with high-level cognitive appraisals coming from working memory. Also added was a metacognitive assessment module that observes modules and traffic among them. It generates low-level appraisals architecturally and transmits the results of its processing to the emotion module. The emotion module here may affect not only the filtering of transmission along the original arrows, but also can affect module operation directly. And this is shown by having the dot dash arrows go to the junctions between the modules and the arrows to working memory. So for example, there's extensive evidence that indicates emotions can influence memory storage and retrieval. Emotions may also provide rewards for reinforcement learning and procedural long-term memory, or for semantic markers in declarative long-term memory. This is a slightly abstracted version of the refined synthesis that drops the metacognitive assessment module and its connections in order to highlight what's going on with the emotion module. So you can see here that there's been a connection added from emotion down to physiology, not just the upward connection from physiology to emotion. This allows emotion vectors to affect physiology. For example, when there's a cognitively identified threat, such as a verbal threat, that requires the body to prepare to respond. As already mentioned, the dot dash arrows from motion here point to the junctions to signify that the module not only filters communications, but modifies module operation. It retains the bidirectional connection between emotion and working memory, supporting high-level cognition emotion interactions. And it retains the bidirectional connection between emotion and perception, although the back arrow here may be redundant with the dot dash arrow that now exists from emotion back to perception. This is a different abstraction of the same refined synthesis that eliminates the dot dash arrows coming from the emotion module in order to highlight the metacognitive assessment module in orange here, as well as the connections it has with other modules. What this implies is that we're modeling appraisals generically as aspects of metacognition. This is a large-scale topic of its own, but without an existing common model consensus, although there is previous work on this topic. Low-level appraisals here are provided by this metacognitive assessment module, based on fixed architectural sensing at junctions between modules and links to working memory. So it can sense communications with working memory as well as the internal operation of modules. This is analogous to what was going on with the arrows coming out of the emotion module. So for example, an appraisal like surprise or familiarity becomes akin here to things like feeling of knowing from the traditional metacognitive literature. High-level appraisals, as already mentioned, seem to be cognitive in nature, whether they're the same cognitive system or a distinct metacognitive system. You can find cognitive architectures that do this in both ways, and this is intended to abstract away that difference, which hopefully will be resolved when metacognition becomes a more direct topic in the work on the common model. There are no arrows back from metacognitive assessment to other modules here, as they're not needed for the emotional modeling, although they certainly might be needed for a full model of metacognition. The feedback here instead goes through the emotion module, and from there via the arrows, some of them are shown here, some of them not shown here, from the emotion module to the other modules. There's an additional question here, and therefore an abstraction, over whether in fact metacognitive system needs to be a module on its own, or whether the functionality can be distributed over the junctions where much of the computation can be considered to be going on. It was left as a module here in this version to allow the possibility that higher level appraisals based on combinations of lower level ones might occur architecturally without having to go through working memory. So for example, the sigma cognitive architecture derives an attention appraisal based on a combination of a bottom-up appraisal for surprisal with a top-down appraisal for desirability. So here's the status of this proposed refinement. We did attempt to determine if a consensus was reachable around it, starting by contacting the attendees at the 2022 workshop. We sent them 2 separate emails requesting input, one informal as free text and one structured more formally as a questionnaire. Unfortunately, the responses were insufficient for us to conclude that there was a consensus even among the workshop attendees. Essentially, there were not that many responses, and the responses we got were insufficient to let us believe that in fact we had achieved a consensus. So no attempt has yet been made at achieving a broader community consensus. Instead, this is presented here as a proposal for further consideration, rather than an agreed upon extension to the common model. But we were able to integrate into both the process and this paper some of the concurring workshop attendees. As a final note, this is still incomplete in many ways with respect to a full model of emotion, sharing the common model's natural abstraction and incompleteness, although here only for what might become a consensus rather than for what actually is a consensus. The hope, though, is that this provides a basis for a wider discussion of extending the common model to emotion.